Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Chapter 5 video lectures. In this lecture video, we're going to discuss how death investigators identify the cause and the manner of death. When a forensic pathologist wants to determine how a person died, they're going to make three different conclusions. First, they're going to determine the cause, then the mechanism, and then the manner of death. Depending on the circumstances, they may also be able to make a time of death determination. To reach these conclusions, forensic pathologists will use multiple data sources, including information that's compiled during the autopsy and the crime scene investigation, as well as medical records and witness statements. So what are these conclusions that I just talked about? The cause of death is defined as the preliminary disease or injury that initiates a lethal chain of events. Causes can be immediate to the death, meaning that they come right before it, or they can be temporally removed. Forensic pathologists must also determine the mechanism of death. That's defined as the specific biochemical or physiologic abnormality that is incompatible with life. Essentially, this is the last thing that happens in the body right before the person dies. The final term that forensic pathologists must be familiar with is the manner of death. And this is a simple classification of death into a set of predefined categories based on the cause and the context of the death. The terms cause and manner of death are often used interchangeably, as though they define the same thing, but they are both distinct terms that a forensic pathologist will use when investigating the death. And so I want to go over each term more in specifics. Both the cause and the mechanism of death are usually identified during an autopsy or body examination. Your book talks a lot about the different types of causes, and I'm going to go over them briefly. Common causes include mechanical trauma, which occurs when objects impact the skin. Mechanical trauma includes blunt force trauma, meaning that the body is impacted by a round or flat object, as well as sharp injuries, which occur when the body is impacted by, well, a sharp object. Mechanical trauma is the type of injuries we normally think about when we think about murder. Things like getting hit over the head with a baseball bat, being stabbed, shot in the abdomen, that type of thing. That's mechanical trauma. Another common cause of death is chemical trauma. Chemical trauma involves exposure to poisons, toxins, or overdoses of chemical substances. What do you think the most common chemical trauma is? If you guessed alcohol-related trauma, you'd be correct. Other common chemical traumas include carbon monoxide poisoning and cyanide poisoning. Now, thermal trauma means that the cause of death was a result of an extreme body temperature. Hypothermia means that the body gets too cold and the person freezes to death. And hyperthermia involves the opposite. When a person gets too hot, they can overheat their organs and they suffer from heat stroke. Electrical trauma means that the cause of death relates to electricity. And that can include man-made electrical shocks, like sticking your hand in an outlet, as well as natural shocks, like being struck by lightning. Another common cause of death is asphyxia, which means that the cause of death comes from a lack of oxygen to the brain. Asphyxia is usually seen in drowning or in strangulation cases. In order to identify the cause of death, you must identify the first event that occurred to start the chain leading to death. However, when dealing with both a disease and an injury, the injury always trumps disease. For example, a common legal fable is about a man with a birth defect that causes him to have a paper-thin skull. This man gets knocked aside and falls down. That force is enough to break his skull and instantly kills him. On a normal, healthy person, the force would have only bruised the individual and would not have resulted in death. So when a forensic pathologist is asked to identify cause of death, what did the person die from? The blunt force trauma of being pushed down or the skull disease? In this case, we would say that he died from blunt force trauma that was exacerbated by the skull disease. But the blunt force trauma is the primary primary event that started the chain to death. One of the primary data sources that help a forensic pathologist determine the cause, mechanism, and manner of death is the autopsy. The autopsy is essentially an investigation of the body. During an autopsy, the person's organs are removed from the body and checked for damage and disease. All injuries and diseased organs will be documented and they can be preserved if necessary. DNA and body fluids are also taken from the body during the autopsy, and they're preserved for later testing. Common bodily fluid testing includes preliminary tests for major drugs of abuse, like alcohol, cocaine, ecstasy, that type of thing. Since the autopsy is considered an investigation, the autopsy process is treated very similarly to crime scene investigation. Photographs and notes are taken of the whole process. In some jurisdictions, the police may have a crime scene representative present during the autopsy, and that person will take photographs and document any suspicious deaths. Other jurisdictions will leave it to the pathologists themselves to document the autopsy process. And that's what happens in Smith County. The coroner's office and the private examiner will document the autopsy procedures themselves, and then they'll provide those investigation results to the police officers. In today's world, advances in technology allow death investigators to receive detailed information about a deceased without actually having to perform a dissection. Called virtual autopsies, these autopsies use technology like MRI machines that provide 2- and 3-dimensional reconstructions of the body. Virtual autopsies are particularly useful in documenting wound tracks and traumatic injury, like this broken skull fracture that was reconstructed from a motorcycle accident victim. While virtual autopsies can be used in conjunction with physical dissections, they also provide opportunities for situations in which the investigators cannot or do not want to do a full dissection. For example, virtual autopsies can be used to conduct death investigations on individuals whose culture or religion prohibits dissection. Virtual autopsies can also be used to do a quick assessment in order to help investigators determine whether or not a full dissection is warranted. Once a forensic pathologist has established the cause and the mechanism of death, they're going to determine the manner of death. The manner of death can only be one of 5 categories, represented by the acronym NASH-U. Manner of death can be natural, meaning that the person died of disease or old age without any intervening event from another person or trauma. An accidental death means that the death was a result of trauma, but resulted from acts that no reasonable person would have felt had a high probability of producing bodily injury or death. For example, if I trip on the floor and crash into you, making you fall and hit your head on the desk, and then you die, that's going to be an accidental death. I created an event and an injury that prompted your death, but no one could have predicted that me tripping over my feet would have led to your death. A suicide and a homicide, on the other hand, are both caused by trauma that would reasonably lead to injury or death. Suicide occurs when the trauma is self-inflicted, whereas homicide means that the trauma is inflicted by another person. Now, it's really important to understand here that the manner of death of homicide does not imply legal guilt. Just because something is labeled as homicide by a medical examiner does not mean that the person should be charged with the crime in the criminal justice system. In some cases, the death is considered legally justified. For example, homicides like shooting someone in self-defense or someone who is killed by lethal injection by the state, these are classified as homicides for manner of death, but are not associated with the same legal guilt like a homicide that occurred during a bank robbery. Now, your textbook only discusses the first 4 categories, but there is another part of the acronym, and that's the U. This stands for undetermined. Undetermined means that the forensic pathologist is unable to determine a manner of death category. SIDS, for example, or sudden infant death syndrome, is classified as an undetermined death. Because infants do not show biological signs of trauma in the same way that adults do, it's more difficult to determine whether an infant died of natural causes or due to trauma, hence the use of the undetermined. Like cause and mechanism of death, forensic pathologists use the autopsy results to help determine the manner of death. However, manner of death conclusions often require additional contextual information. Manner of death investigations usually include supplemental data like the person's medical history, witness statements, and the crime scene investigation results. These data sources help provide the forensic pathologist with information about the people and the behaviors that contributed to the final death event. For example, if the cause of death was listed as chemical trauma due to exposure to cyanide, it would be important to identify whether the person imbibed the poison on purpose, making the death a suicide, or if someone else poisoned them, making the death a homicide. All right, well, that concludes the second part of the Chapter 5 lectures. Join me in the last lecture video for this chapter when I conclude it talking about the postmortem interval.